very much, Petra. It's very nice to be back here in Prague. History is hard. The business that we're engaged in is really quite difficult. It's hard enough to work out what happened 60 years ago, let alone what happened 6,000 years ago. And in principle, our life would be a little bit easier if we could bring together linguistics, genetics, and archaeology, and we could triangulate these different inferences. What I want to do in this talk today is look at some of the pleasures and pitfalls of trying to triangulate inferences from linguistics, genetics, and archaeology. And in particular, I'll be focusing on how two recent developments really help bring together these different lines of evidence. First of all, the impact of ancient DNA, and secondly, the ability to build dated language phylogenies, how this helps us make more rigorous inferences about the past. So this is just to illustrate this. This is one of my favorite quotes from the American military historian Holt, who said, "Historical inference is a damn dim candle held over a damn dark abyss." So that's the difficult business that we're engaged in. What I want to do today is look at three sort of case studies, really, of trying to bring together inferences from linguistics, genetics, and archaeology. First of all, I want to look at a recent attempt to do this with the spread of the putative Trans-Eurasian family. Secondly, I want to compare that with what we've been able to do in understanding the prehistory of the Pacific. And thirdly, I want to talk about the recent debates about the origins and spread of the Indo-European languages and cultures and people. Okay, Trans-Eurasian. Trans-Eurasian is a very controversial linguistic subgroup that allegedly unites a whole lot of 5 different language families: Korean, Mongolic, Tungusic, Japonic. And you should always worry when you see figures like this with big red arrows on them. This is the summary figure from a recent paper by Martina Roberts and colleagues that was published in the journal Nature. And it claims that 3 lines of evidence from linguistics, genetics, and archaeology explain the spread driven by farming of these 5 language groups that have their origins here 7,000 years ago. I guess I should use the pointer on the screen here, and spread with the spread of farming. Now, I want to go through and look at each of the lines of evidence that they claim supports this kind of grand narrative. So firstly, and in doing this, I'm summarizing a critique that you can find online. This critique has been posted on the bioarchive from myself and many kind of colleagues. First of all, does the genetic evidence support this? If you look back at the map, one of the kind of key claims here is that there's 2 migrations, separate migrations into Korea. And you can ask, well, does the genetic evidence really support that? And in the paper, buried away in the supplementary material, as things often are in Nature papers, is a slight disclaimer that actually maybe the genetic evidence doesn't really discriminate. So when we reanalyzed their genetic data, what we found was that it actually had no power whatsoever to discriminate these 2 putatively major separate population movements. So the first major part of the kind of triangle of inferences, the genetic evidence, doesn't support the claims that were actually made in the paper. What about the archaeology? What they did was to gather a whole lot of data from different archaeological sites and then throw it into a kind of phylogeny program. And in doing that, you assume that these archaeological sites all have some kind of common or shared history that must be related through descent. What we did was to reanalyze their data, and here you can see a phylogenetic tree where we reanalyzed their data. And on the whole, you can see that this is not a resolved phylogenetic tree. There's very little ability in this archaeological data to discriminate the groups. And And what we found was that they claimed that there should be a sort of close sister-taxa relationship between two groups, and we weren't able to reproduce that whatsoever. We're also able to show that apart from just the lack of resolution and the lack of claimed kind of subgrouping in this phylogenetic analysis of the archaeological data, the actually different types of archaeological data had different signals. So there wasn't a single underlying kind of history here, but probably multiple histories. So I think this is an example of a really unthoughtful practice. Just take a whole lot of data, throw it into a phylogeny program, get some tree, claim it supports this kind of grand narrative when actually it doesn't. So the second line of the triangle falls down. Well, what about the linguistics? Surely the linguistics must be good, because this the whole concept of a superfamily, this Triangulating language family, is a linguistic concept. So we had a look at the linguistic data, and the linguistic data consists of what linguists call cognate sets. These are sets of homologous words, words allegedly related by descent. And their data contains over 3,000 putative cognate sets. But when we looked closely, only 50 of those were shared by 2 or more of the 5 language families. And when we look even more closely, only 17 of those 50 followed the author's alleged kind of sound correspondence rules, that they were, and gave consistent groupings. Bear in mind that I think only 2 of those, only 2 out of the 3,000 odd, were actually found in all 5 language families. So that's chance that you'll find out of 3,000 things sets 2 that look like they might be related in all 5 language families. So not only did they try and build some overall language phylogeny based on what our reanalysis of their evidence suggests actually quite disparate language families, they looked allegedly at reconstructing agricultural terms. And if we looked in detail at their linguistic evidence and see whether, for example, they're all reconstructible, these agricultural-related terms, to this alleged language superfamily Proto-Trans-Eurasian, only about 24 might be potentially reconstructible. But if you looked if they had accurate semantics that were actually tied to specific agricultural things, then there were only 7. And if we looked at it out of those 7, if they followed what linguists call systematic sound correspondences, this, for example, might be the famous P to F change in Indo-European of Grimshaw. That's an example of a systematic sound correspondence. The set of those that fit all those criteria is 0. So we're just completely unconvinced that the linguistic data, first of all, supports the unity of the Trans-Eurasian family, and secondly, can legitimately be used to reconstruct agricultural terms for this language superfamily. So, although there is this grand narrative and allegedly some evidence that supports it, if you look in detail, all 3 sides of the triangle collapse. So that's an example, I think, of a good aim, bring different lines of evidence together, but bad practice. There was an existing kind of narrative that the superfamily existed and that it must have been spread with farming. And so some evidence was gathered, but analysed in a very poor way that didn't really rigorously test the hypothesis. And it's hard to test these kind of big hypotheses. Why is it hard? Well, it's hard because sometimes you can get patterns that look like they might be similar. They might show similar geographic patterns, for example. So you might say, well, look, this tree we have for genes here looks like it's paralleled with this tree that we have for languages. But you can get pseudocongruence. If we were to add dates into these trees, you can see, although the geographic patterning perhaps is similar, the time depth is very different. I think this is a point I want to really emphasize in my talk today, that dates really do make a difference. And one of the great things about ancient DNA and the dated language phylogenies that I'm going to be talking about is that they enable us to put together in a much more rigorous way inferences from genes, language, and archaeology. If you can not only locate things in space, but also in time, then you can be more confident about the inferences. Now, that also sounds good, but the received view in linguistics is that linguists can't do dates. There was this approach called glottochronology back in the 50s and 60s, and it failed spectacularly. There were some well-known failures where the inference was made, for example, that Iceland was only settled 200 years ago, but we know it was actually settled about 1,000 years ago. So the received view is that linguists can subgroup languages so they can get a relative chronology, but they can't get absolute chronology. I don't like that. I think we these days can do better using computational methods from evolutionary biology that don't require the assumption of strict clock-like behavior, the so-called relaxed clock methods that people use to analyze molecular data. And we've been applying these to look at language data and trying to make accurate inferences about linguistic past in the Pacific and in Europe. And it's the Pacific that I want to now turn to as a case study of, I think, how we can try and do this business of triangulation in a more rigorous way. And my inspiration for this comes from these two scholars here, Pat Kirch and Roger Green, both archaeologists, who wrote what I think is a rather nice book about reconstructing ancestral Polynesian society, where they tried to bring together inferences from archaeology and linguistics. There wasn't really ancient DNA available, but they explicitly talk about triangulating inferences, in their case from biology, linguistics, and archaeology. And it's really guided by their model that I started this work. Here's a summary. You always got to be careful with these migration diagrams with big red arrows. But here's a summary, I think a pretty uncontentious summary of what we know based on Pacific archaeology about the people near the Pacific. And it's fairly well established that people moved from Taiwan, perhaps or into Taiwan about 5,500 years ago. And these were Austronesian-speaking people. Archaeologically, you can see that there's a pause between the early archaeological sites in Taiwan and the settlement of the Philippines about 4,000 years ago. Then, archaeologically, you can see that there's this rapid expansion all the way from the Philippines, actually off the screen here, out to Madagascar, and along the coast of New Guinea, and out into remote Oceania around about 3,000 years ago. So it's really rapid population expansion. And you can see it archaeologically with the intrusion of new material culture along the coast of New Guinea. And starting, and the dates, there's chronometric hygiene going on, and dates continue to be revised a bit, but the dates for the presence of what is termed lapida pottery culture here in near and remote Oceania date back now to around about 3,200 years ago. And there's this relatively discrete cultural, we were sort of talking earlier on about what we mean by archaeological cultures. And I think a lot of times when people talk about archaeological cultures, you can't really be confident that these things are bundled together. But with lapida, there was a window where things do seem to be bundled together. You get these very distinctive dentate stamped pots, and you get an intrusion of new people. And for a very brief period of time, only about 3,500 years, you can see the presence of these lapida pots from the Admiralties up here to as far as Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. And then they stop making those pots, and you get kind of various planeware that's not making these dentate stamped pots anymore. Archaeologically, you can then see that there's a pause from the settlement of the Central Pacific to a movement much later, maybe 1,200 years ago, out into the far reaches of Eastern Polynesia, all the way to Easter Island, almost certainly to the coast of South America too, because they were able to bring back kumara, the sweet potato, which we know has its origins in South America, including the settlements in the most remote parts of the Pacific, Aotearoa, New Zealand here, and Hawaii way up there. And just to give you some idea of the vastness of those oceanic kind of voyages, perhaps in these large double-hulled canoes, it takes, I think, 8 hours to fly from New Zealand to Hawaii. These are truly vast voyages, the last great kind of population expansion in the globe. That's what the archaeological record shows. And these things can be relatively clear-cut because remote Oceania was not peopled until the movement of Austronesian-speaking people there. Now, how should triangulation proceed? Because genes and languages don't always have to go together. And it can be hard to bring together information, genes, language, and archaeology. Bones don't speak. Genes and languages can have different kind of histories. How can we really adopt a more principled approach? So with my colleague, Simon Greenhill and Bob Blust, what we wanted to do was to try and say, well, this is what archaeology says. Can we make predictions about the patterns that we might see in the linguistic data? And what we adopted is what's called a Bayesian phylogenetic approach to building language trees. So first of all, we start off with some lexical data, and you can see here various words. What we do is we cognate code them. That is, certain words, you can see 2 here, that not only look a bit similar, but more rigorously show systematic sound correspondences that indicate that they have a common history, a shared origin, and we convert those into binary cognate sets. Because we're doing Bayesian analysis, we have various bits of prior information, tree priors on branch links. We can incorporate some archaeological information to give us time depths. And in the analysis I'm going to show you, the only bit of, the central bit of timing that we used was just that discrete window for Lapida. And so we calibrated our language tree on the timing of the movement into Oceania. So that's pretty kind of uncontentious. But all the other dates we did not put in as priors into the analysis. What we're doing is modeling in a stochastic way the gains and losses of these cognate sets. And then what we do is we search through tree and parameter space. And here you can see a sort of visual summary of how that search might go, where we're trying to find not a single tree, but a set of trees that fit the data really well, given the kind of priors and given the model. So we end up with a posterior distribution of trees that you can see here. That's the basic Bayesian phylogenetic approach. So just to show you in more detail what that means we don't forget about real linguistic scholarship. Here you can see one of my heroes, Bob Blust, in what I like to call his natural habitat. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but you can see him surrounded by data, surrounded by word lists. What Simon Greenhill and I did was to take all these word lists, and you can see just one here. This is like the kind of raw data. We converted them into like a web accessible database. Initially, we started with 230 word lists from Bob, and now we have data for over 1,200 Austronesian languages. And then we had a variety of experts. So again, just because this is computational doesn't mean there's not humanities scholarship involved. We had a range of experts cognate code these languages. And here you can just see another example of cognate coding. Terms for father, like in Tongan, it's tama'ai. In Fijian, it's tamana. And you can see that although there are some differences, it looks probable these are cognate terms, whereas these two terms are a separate cognate set. So that's basically what's happening with the cognate coding of the data. And sometimes people say, well, why do you need to use computational methods? Well, if you have 5 trees, 5 languages, there's 105 possible ways you can relate them. If you have 10, there's 34 million possible ways you might relate those languages. And if you have over 100, there's more possible language trees you could build than there are atoms in the universe. So this seems to be crying out for a computational approach. And that's why we use these Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms to search through tree and parameter space to find a set of trees that are a good fit given the data and given the models. Okay, back to the claim. What does this archaeological scenario predict in terms of a language phylogeny? What it predicts is that the basal language lineages, the earliest branches should be in Taiwan. That there should be a pause on the tree, a long branch length before the settlement of the Philippines. Then a series of really short branch lengths showing this rapid expansion through Borneo, Sulawesi, and the Philippines, and out along the New Guinea coast, all the way out to central Polynesia. Then another long branch, another pause, before the relatively rapid expansion into eastern Polynesia. So it's predicting about what we should see at the base of the tree, what we should see in terms of pulses and pauses, and it's also making predictions about the dates. The date for the root of the tree should be around about 5,500 years ago. The date for the expansion into remote Oceania should be about 1,200 years ago. And it should follow the sequence. It's actually a lot of predictions. So let's see what our language phylogeny look like. You can see a summary tree. We don't find just a single tree, but a set of trees, and then we can summarize those as a maximum clade credibility tree. And if you look, you can see that the deepest lineages are indeed the Formosan languages of Taiwan. There is indeed, as predicted, this long pause before the settlement of the Philippines. Again, as predicted, this rapid expansion pulse, and then another long pause before the settlement of the most remote parts of Polynesia. So I think this spectacular fit there between what the archaeological record claimed and showed, and what we can see in the detailed patterns in the language phylogeny. So in the words that we speak every day, there's actually quite a lot of fine-grained information about the past. And you can see that the dates matched. We've calibrated one point of the tree here, the movement into Oceania associated with Lapedo. But the rest of the dates come out of the analysis. And we can see that we get an estimate around about 5,500 years here, and an estimate of around about 1,200 years here. So I think if people wonder about do these methods work, this is a really tough test. And it shows that we really can test archaeological scenarios with Bayesian phylogenetic analyses of linguistic data. But there's more that this tree might predict. You could flip it around and say, what does it predict in terms of, say, genetics? Is it supported by the genetics? Because languages and genes don't always have to go together. They probably do if you're settling into most remote parts of the Pacific, because they weren't people before. But the island of Southeast Asia certainly was. So perhaps it could have been that there was some cultural expansion here and then a demographic expansion here. What does the genetics show? The genetics shows that there was indeed a demographic expansion, one that can be traced back all the way back to Taiwan, and that fits, I think, quite well with the detailed patterning in this Austronesian language phylogeny. And the fit is even more detailed than these rather schematic diagrams show. I go back to our tree. Hidden away in here are some early splits into the most remote parts of the Pacific, the islands of Chamorro and Palau. And we would infer that they were settled fairly early on, and actually archaeologically, it shows that they were settled about 3,600 years ago. So in terms of the peopling of Micronesia, we've got, at least for Chamorro and Palau, a very early movement in here. And then kind of hidden away down in here, there's some separate movements we'd infer linguistically into Micronesia. And I'm once again really pleased, maybe not entirely surprised, that there was this recent paper published last year by the Wright group showing that the genetics, again, strongly parallels the linguistic inferences. There were these multiple movements into Micronesia. So to kind of summarize, we've been able to test an archaeological scenario using linguistic data, And that linguistic data makes predictions about the patterns we should see in the genetics, and those genetic inferences fit remarkably accurately with the linguistic inferences. One more point. Notice this paper here has the title, Ancient DNA Reveals 5 Streams of Migration into Micronesia, as the linguistics predicted. But then the matrolocality was early in Pacific seafarers. So matrolocality is quite common in Austronesian societies. And I'm not surprised by this conclusion that they had based on genetic data. But if they'd read some work that we'd done like a decade before, we exactly predicted this. What we used is an approach that Fiona Jordan calls virtual social archaeology. Imagine you have some information on post-marital residence patterns, and you have a language phylogeny. And if the deepest lineages are all matrilocal, and then the more recent ones are patrilocal, the inference would be the ancestral society here was matrilocal, and then there was a switch to patrilocality. What we did was apply that kind of approach, but in a Bayesian way, to Austronesian societies. So here's the distribution of post-marital residence patterns across the Austronesian range. And you can see patrilocality shown in blue, matrolocality shown in red, and ambilocal shown in black. When we apply that kind of Bayesian phylogeny approach to reconstructing post-marital residence patterns, there's moderate support, or strong support for the idea that Proto-Polynesian, was matrilocal, and moderate support for the idea that Proto-Oceanic might have been matrilocal. And actually, in the discussion, I talked about the probable role of Papuan contact in changing this Proto-Malay-Polynesian matrilocal system into a patrilocal one, which is more common in Papua New Guinea. So just one more way in which you might want to bring together inferences, in this case about patterns of social organization, from linguistics together with ancient DNA evidence. Okay, sometimes people tell me, this is all well and good, Russell, but the Pacific is easy. You happen to just be lucky, and you've got this relatively recent population expansion into an area of the world that wasn't settled before. Nowhere else is life that simple. Here in Europe, things are very complicated. These approaches wouldn't work. And I say, you don't know enough about the settlement of the Pacific, because actually things are a lot more complicated than the story that I've told you so far. And here we return to my hero, Bob Blust. And Bob Blust pointed out quite a while ago a problem with that standard narrative as a complete account of the peopling of the Pacific. And firstly, he said, well, if that's all there is, if that's all that happened in Pacific history, then how come the people in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, don't look like the people in Vanuatu, and don't look like the people in New Caledonia, for example? He pointed out that there were some interesting cultural similarities between parts of Vanuatu and New Caledonia and New Guinea. He pointed out that there was this unusual distribution of what linguists call serial verb constructions that didn't fit with this sort of west to east grand migration. And there were some patterns in the linguistic data that, again, seemed to not easily be explained with that overall simple narrative. Let's look at those in more detail. So here's just a famous painting by John Goldie of a Maori chief. And I don't really like talking about broad scale ethnic features, but the kind of thing that Bob Blust observed is that the peoples in this region are almost, and he's talking about kind of the so-called Melanesian region, again, a term that I'm not particularly comfortable with, but that's what we want to call, say, Vanuatu and New Caledonia, have darker skins and frizzier hair than others, Austronesian speakers. And in this respect, are largely indistinguishable from most Papuan speakers. In some parts of Melanesia, beyond the reach of Papuan languages, the prominent nose and full beards of many men are strikingly similar to those common amongst Highland New Guinea. So what he's pointing out is that it looks in these phenotypic features like there's perhaps a hint of a more complex history that might involve links not just back to Taiwan, but also links to Papua New Guinea. And he pointed out that there are some shared unusual cultural features, nasal piercings and penis sheaths that occur in Papua New Guinea and in parts of Vanuatu. Also, there's practices of head binding and the rearing of these circular tusked pigs that are shared between parts of Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu. As a linguist, he went on to point out that if you look at the distribution of numeral systems, so most Austronesian languages have a decimal system. So in Maori, it's tahi, rua, toru, wha, rima, ono, whitu, wara, iu, te kao, that's 1 to 10. But interestingly, around parts of New Guinea and also in Vanuatu and New Caledonia, there seems to be a loss of the decimal system and a switch to quinary systems, 5-base systems. And if you look at that switch, it looks like, so the purple here is like demarcating a decimal system, and this is just a phylogeny we have for Vanuatu languages, and all the other colors show a switch away, or a movement away to different forms of quinary systems. Finally, Blust noted that there is incredibly rare sounds, one of which is a bilabial trill. I can't do it perfectly, but that's something like the sound, made only in like 1% of the world's languages. And that again occurs in some parts of Vanuatu and some parts of Papua New Guinea. So all these bits of evidence, a lot of people might say, well, they're very circumstantial. Maybe you're just cherry picking some chance features. But what he did was to use it to make a prediction. And the prediction was that yes, there was this rapid expansion of Austronesian speakers, but that was subsequently followed by an expansion of people that used oceanic voyaging technology, but were speaking Papuan languages. And it was contact with those Papuan speakers that drove these repeated cultural and linguistic similarities. So there wasn't one mode of migration, there were two. And the second one was mainly Papuans. And the term Papuan is, another one is not very helpful kind of cultural terms. You might say some people from parts of Papua New Guinea might be a better way of putting it. Okay, how would you test that? Go to Vanuatu, work with archaeologists, work with the cultural centre in Vanuatu, get permission to bring back human remains and do the ancient DNA. Because if Blust, the linguist, was correct, then what you'd expect to see in the ancient DNA is that the earliest ones, the earliest samples, those associated with lepidosites, should look like Austronesian or oceanic speakers. They should have a lot of genetic similarities to, say, the people in Eastern Polynesia and also further back into Southeast Asia. But then there should be evidence of a second demographic input of very distantly related so-called Papuan genotypes. So I went to Vanuatu, I worked with the cultural centre and got samples from ancient sites across the islands of Vanuatu. And Vanuatu is like a fascinating place. There are more languages per capita in Vanuatu than there are anywhere in the world. There's 140 languages spoken in Vanuatu, just over 300,000 speakers. So where did we get some samples? Well, we got some samples, a lot from the island of Malakula, but also from Mapate down here on Tana, and also from Fortuna. And here are the archaeologists and geneticists we work with, the two archaeologists, Frederick Valentine and Stuart Bedford, the geneticists, Cosmo Post, Johannes Krause, and Katrin Nagelin. What do we find? Well, if you look at present-day genetic variation, and here's one of these principal component analyses that geneticists love. So you're summarizing this vastly highly dimensional data in just two main dimensions. And what we can see is that there's a group here of East Asian and Southeast Asian. Tongans are here, people in the Solomon Islands are here, and so-called Papuans are down here. There's a big separation between, if you like, Southeast Asians and Papuans. And Tongans are somewhere in the middle. What happens when we looked at where those Lapita samples would occur? Well, we found that they were much closer, as you'd predict by the sort of Austronesian expansion, kind of out of Taiwan, to these Southeast Asian samples. We had some samples from modern Vanuatu, and they look very similar to modern day people in parts of Papua New Guinea. We had one sample, I think, from the island of Tanna, 2,500 years ago. The settlement of Vanuatu dates back to about 3,000 years. So there's a sample like just 500 years later from Tanna that's completely indistinguishable from kind of modern Papuan samples. So evidence that would fit with Bob Glass' claim that people of Papuan genotypes did indeed get out to the remote Oceania relatively soon after the initial Austronesian expansion there. And if we look in a more fine-grained way, these are these admixture analyses at our different samples. You can see in blue that the early Lapita sites would all fit with like a very dominant kind of Asian ancestry. Here's this individual from Tanna that looks completely unadmixed Papuan. And as we go through time, you can see that over about 1,000 years, there's an increasing dominance of these Papuan genotypes. So I think this is, again, striking support for a linguistic prediction that although these people are speaking Austronesian languages, Oceanic Austronesian languages, genetically, these modern populations are highly admixed and show this very strong so-called Papuan signal. All right, this is just something I added into the discussion that we had over lunch, because I thought it would fit with the kind of themes that we were talking about, and about bringing different lines of evidence together. In this case, I want to talk about oral histories as a potential source of hypotheses to be tested. There's an island off Efate in Vanuatu called, they call it Roy Martyr's Domain, or the Hat Island. This, if you look at it, has these large stones in this circular area here. This is actually a historic burial site. And it's the site where this famous Vanuatu chief was buried. And oral traditions had it that there was this very famous chief called Roy Martyr about 500 years ago, who there was lots of warfare going on, but he invited people from different clans to come together and created a huge feast. And he invented this fictive kinship system. The people that brought yams, they became the Yam clan. The people that brought octopus, they became the octopus clan. And he said, because you're now the same clan as these people, you can't fight with them. They're your fictive kin. And so peace broke out in Vanuatu. That was the oral tradition. And apparently, he later on, he went to a feast, he got ill, and he died. And allegedly he was buried, and 150 people, men and women, were buried alive on top. Such was this kind of cultural significance and fame that demanded this massive human sacrifice. That was the oral tradition. Early archaeologists, I think, were rather skeptical, couldn't find a burial place, but eventually sort of asked the locals. And sure enough, here is the burial, and you can see it's marked by these large stones that were actually transported from distant islands. So I think Garaget, some other archaeologists, I think it was in the 70s, actually excavated the site. Sure enough, there were lots of skeletons. It looked like the woman might have been bound. Allegedly, the men had taken a strong carver. There was indeed a large number of them. At the bottom was someone buried with various ornaments that looked like he might have been the chief. Somehow, and if you think about how this chief had been acting, actually, this is where it becomes relevant, he had not been acting like a so-called Melanesian chief. He'd been acting more like a big chief from Polynesian societies, in that he'd been coordinating kind of social action on a large-scale group. So that wouldn't fit with the kind of small-scale Melanesian localism. So you might say, well, if this oral tradition was true, and certainly the stories about the burial and the dating of it validated the oral traditions, that was true, then maybe he was a Polynesian chief, not a small-scale Melanesian chief. Well, what do we know linguistically? Linguistically, we know that there was a Polynesian back migration, a third complicating element in Pacific history. Remember I told you this? Pacific history is more complicated than you might have thought. So there were two waves. The third wave was a movement of some Polynesians coming back into parts of so-called Melanesia. And you can see here some islands or offshore communities scattered across Vanuatu where there are Polynesian languages now spoken. And this is just one of those imai where I've been working with archaeologists Mira Kerman and Stuart Bedford, and here's a recent excavation. And interestingly, there are signs of this recent excavation of both the sort of Melanesian input. You can see the circular tusks and circular tusk pigs here that have made into these ornaments. You see this person's holding a mirror, but they've also got some shell beads that look very Polynesian. And there is indeed a Polynesian language spoken on this island. So the claim is that there was this back migration, but was there a single back migration or multiple back migrations? And was Roy Mata really Polynesian, predominantly Polynesian? So again, the Harvard group somehow got access to a sample from the Roy Mata kind of burial site that somehow made it back to a museum in Paris, and recently published a paper in Current Biology. And what they were able to show was that there is indeed two migrations, two Polynesian migrations into these islands of Vanuatu. So once again, striking sport, in this case for some predictions that might come out of claims about oral history, backed up by linguistics that shows that there was indeed back migrations, and now confirmed with the genetics. And this is just some recent work that Simon Greenholm, very well with, and I've been doing. And you can see here on our phylogenetic tree for languages, here's a group of languages spoken around Vanuatu, and here's another group spoken around Vanuatu, showing evidence, two evidences of these separate back migrations, exactly as we see in the genetic data here. All right, so to summarize, what I've been arguing is that in the Pacific, it's actually an ideal kind of test case for our ability to rigorously bring together inferences from linguistics, genetics, and archaeology. And the history of the people of the Pacific isn't as straightforward as the kind of linear west to east kind of grand narrative. Yes, there was this initial Austronesian expansion, but that was followed by an expansion of kind of Papuan genotypes a short time after. And in the last 1,000 years, there have been multiple back migrations from the Pacific. All those inferences are backed up linguistically, genetically, and archaeology. So that, I think, is what we've been able to do to triangulate different lines of evidence in the Pacific. What about Europe? These are all the people I need to thank, firstly, actually, before I go on to that. The combination of linguists, geneticists, and archaeologists. All right, Indo-European, the bloody Indo-European problem. That for over 200 years has plagued linguists. For over 200 years, people have been arguing where the Indo-Europeans came from. Jared Diamond and Peter Bellwood once described it as the most intensively studied, yet still most recalcitrant problem of historical linguistics. And in broad terms, there are two major hypotheses for the origin and spread of the Indo-European languages. The first account is the steppe hypothesis that said that these languages date back to the Pontic steppe about 6,000 years ago. Sometimes it's associated with the spread of horses, warring Hugans, but it doesn't always have to be propelled by kind of warfare. But there's a sort of general consensus amongst most linguists that the languages can be dated back, or can be traced back to the steppe. An alternative hypothesis came from the archaeologist Colin Renfrew, who argued that the languages spread not by conquest, but by cultivation. They spread out of Anatolia, not 6,000 years ago, but he thought about 9,000 years ago with the spread of agriculture. Now, many years ago, Quentin Atkins and I thought, well, this should be really easy to test. All we need to do is build a dated language tree for Indo-European and see whether the root age is 6,000 years or whether it's 9,000 years ago. And look, we've got solved the 200-year problem. So we published this paper back in 2003, where we inferred that the origin, that the initial dating of the Indo-European languages supported the Anatolian hypothesis and conflicted with the Pontic hypothesis. We got roundly attacked and abused by many linguists for doing so. We followed up some years later with a kind of phylogenetic analysis of the Indo-European languages. We tried not only to locate in time, but also in space, the origins of the language family. Got a slightly younger date using more sophisticated methods, but again, inferred a homeland roughly in the Anatolian region. Now, in the first of those papers, we did have a little paragraph pointing out that these hypotheses don't necessarily need to be mutually exclusive. I'm really pleased I wrote that, and you'll see why. In a minute, you'll see why. There were lots of fairly abusive things written about our claims by linguists, to be blunt. Some of them that come close to basically calling us Nazis, which is, like, I think, just completely ad hominem and not true. The best arguments against our inferences were that we treated the ancient languages we had in our sample in an appropriate way. So this was work done at Berkeley by Will Chang and Andrew Garrett and colleagues. And Andrew used to say to me, Russell, we know you're wrong, we just need to work out why. So what they did was to take our approach and said, well, look, what you've done is to treat these ancient languages, say like Latin or Vedic Sanskrit, as sister taxa that have branched off, say, from the Italic or Indic language families, and you've got a calibration above those. But that's wrong. These ancient languages like Latin and Vedic, they should be direct ancestors. There should be a 0 branch length to them. And what Will Chang clearly did was to rewrite the phylogenetic program so he could make these ancient languages be directly ancestral. And in doing that, what you do is you take that small branch length and you push all those changes further up the tree. And therefore, you get faster rates of change further up the tree. And with faster rates of change, you get you get faster change, therefore you get earlier dates. And when they did that, they were able to miraculously, wonderfully infer that the age of Indo-European was really 6,000 years old, as linguists had always known. And so this, I thought, was a really interesting thing to do and a really principled, non-ad hominem attack. The question is, how convincing is the claim that these ancient languages should be really directly ancestral, and what, if any, are the problems with what they found? Well, they find an age of 6,000 years ago. That's fine. But if you look at, say, what happens with Latin in their analysis, you get the divergence of all the Romancer varieties happening in just the last 1,000 years. And that's just historically false. So what they've done by making these languages directly ancestral is to get an answer that made many people happy. Everything can be traced back to the Pontic 6,000 years ago, but they've created historically false things down here. And if you look at what happens with the separation of Icelandic up here, again, that's far too recent, complex with known historical divergences. So, still plagued by this 200-year problem, what have we been doing more recently? Working with a large group of linguists, what we've been doing is trying to improve the quality of the data. This is where I want to once again emphasize that historical linguistic scholarship really matters. There were problems in some of the versions of the data that have been used in the past. The information had been not collected consistently across different languages. In some languages, there were far too many synonyms that had been included. And here you can see whole lots of multiple words for child, whereas the rule typically in the collection of these so-called Swadesh word lists is that you only use the most common lexeme. So on average, for each concept, there should be one word, the words that's used most often. But this had not been consistently applied. And that mattered because it can mess up the branch length estimates, which can mess up the dates in a tree. So working with a team of over 80 linguists, coordinated by Paul Hegarty and Cormac Anderson, we created a new database that you can find online with every bit of information traceable back to the sources for a much bigger, more rigorously coded Indo-European data set. So we have data now for 170 meanings in so-called basic vocabulary, the words we use most often, for 161 Indo-European languages, 52 of which are ancient languages. We use those ancient languages as calibration points to help with the time depth estimates. And just to point out that we solve what Paul Hegarty calls the butterfly problem. If you look at the excess of synonyms in previous versions of the data set, we've eliminated that. So we should have much more consistent coding and therefore better branch length estimates. We also wanted to explore computationally the consequences of different assumptions about ancestry. What we did was use recent developments in the program BEAST to let the data choose. Should ancient languages like Latin or Vedic, Sanskrit, be direct ancestors or should they be small branches off the side? Rather than enforcing either one, let the data choose. So we used new data and these methods that let the data choose about direct ancestry. What we found was that here's sort of a prior probability distribution for lots of direct ancestors. The data strongly push against that. Very few of our 52 odd ancient languages wanted to be direct ancestors to any modern ones. And as a consequence of that, here's not a single tree, but like a density plot of our set of most probable Indo-European linguistic relationships, dated. The sort of inference we get is not a single point, but a distribution centered around about 8,100 years ago. And the data push against the prior, they make it older than the prior inference, the priors we put in the data set. So it's really being driven by the data rather than just the priors. Okay, so does this support the Anatolian hypothesis? I'm going to argue no. That neither the Anatolian hypothesis nor the Pontic hypothesis are fully justable to explain the distribution and diversification of all Indo-European languages. Before I do that, I should emphasize that a lot of people think this is an easy business. You just take some data, put it in the program, out comes the result. The hard work computationally is done on testing the robustness of the inferences. And this is work that was done mainly by Ben King in the paper that was recently out in Science. And so here we have our main analysis, but then we do whole lots of different robustness tests where we change the assumptions, where we remove particular calibrations, where we treat loans in different ways, whether we assume that there might have been 400 Indo-European languages over the history of Indo-European or 600 to 800, when we remove poorly attested languages, when we change some constraints on the tree, when we enforce different topologies, when we even make Latin a direct ancestor, or even have 5 direct ancestors. None of those things can get us into the time depth proposed by the Pontic hypothesis. So those are really strong tests of the robustness of our inferences. Even with enforcing 27 direct ancestors, which is completely unjustified by the kind of data, we still don't go into the kind of Pontic time depth zone. So we're really quite convinced that our data for the initial origins of the Indo-European languages are not consistent with a 6,000-year-old date. But on the other hand, we know from genetics that there really was this massive migration from the Pontic steppe about 5,000 years ago. This is work done by my colleague, Wolfgang Heik and colleagues. And if you look at that paper carefully, the wording is very careful. These results provide support for a steppe origin of at least some of the Indo-European languages of Europe. But that's that's not all the Indo-European languages. There's languages in India and Iran, amongst kind of other places. So notice how cautious that they were about what they claimed. So this is often cited as strong support for the Pontic hypothesis, but the actual claim was much more restricted. If you look at the genetic evidence, and here again is one of these principal component analyses, here are the Yamnaya samples, here are Caucasian hunter-gatherers, here's Eastern hunter-gatherers, and you can see that this Yamnaya population is a combination of those two ancestries. But I want to focus on the input from the Caucasus. So I think, yes, it's very clear and contestable there was this large expansion, this demographic expansion from the steppe about 5,000 years ago, not 6,000 years ago. But if you look at what you might call kind of tracidae, there are these admixture plots. If you look for something that you see across all the Indo-European range, it's neither this kind of early Neolithic farmer signal, nor this kind of Yamnaya signal. Instead, it's this Caucasian hunter-gatherer input that's actually shared broadly across the distribution of the whole language family. Most recently, there was a paper again published by the Harvard group where they had some samples from Anatolia, and these showed no Pontic input, zero Pontic input. And that's a substantial nail in the coffin for anyone who wants to claim that the entire language family, which includes Anatolia, languages such as Hittite, can be traced back to the Pontic steppe. They proposed a kind of model where there was this origin south of the Caucasus, then a massive movement onto the steppe, and then subsequent secondary migrations. When working with Johannes Krauser and Wolfgang Hayek and colleagues, we look closely at the data. What we can see is that, yes, no Pontic signal in these ancient Anatolian samples. But if you look in, say, Greece and in Albania and in India and in Armenia, typically the evidence of Pontic input is relatively small, and also the timing of it seems too late to be consistent with this initial secondary migration from the steppe. So what we suggested in this recent paper is that the solution to the sort of 200-year-old dilemma about the origin of European languages, it lies in a kind of hybrid hypothesis, which is neither purely Anatolian nor purely the steppe. Instead, we suggest there was an origin not 9,000 years ago, and not in Western Anatolia, but in the northern Fertile Crescent about 8,000 years ago, a movement from the south of the Caucasus onto the steppe, starting about 7,000 years ago, this big expansion from the steppe about 5,000 years ago. And so we tried to put some of this information together. Here again is our Bayesian distribution of trees. You can see the root for Proto-Indo-European goes back to about 8,000 years ago. We get the split up of the early major branches of Indo-European around about 7,000 years ago. We need to be cautious here with trying to match up these things, but that seems to be about the same time that this Caucasian Iranian ancestry spreads from south of the Caucasus onto the steppe. 5,000 years ago, you can see here at least the splitting off of some of the major Indo-European subgroups. Doesn't entirely match up with the 5,000-year date for that steppe expansion. And then, of course, there's the tricky thing about, well, matching up to archaeological cultures, because we're not really testing hypotheses here. But for interest, just to look at the timing of here is the Indic subgroup, and you can see the timing that is intriguingly parallel with the Indus Valley civilization. And here you can see the timing of Yamnaya, Cordiware, and Velbeka. I don't want to claim too much about those kind of putative links. I think the things that are really robust is this kind of early time depth and a link south of the Caucasus. So with those kind of caveats and cautions about summary maps with big arrows in them, I want to present our putative hybrid hypothesis for the origins of Indo-European. And the family goes back not to Western Anatolia, but to the northern Fertile Crescent about 8,000 years ago. There's a spread across this way into Anatolia and Albania and Greece, and we equivocate on this. There could have been a spread eastwards into India and Iran, but we don't rule out the possibility that they may have also come from the north, although we notice that the time depth doesn't really fit with that. Timing for the breakup of the Indo-Iranian group goes back about 5,500 years ago. So this is the way in which we're trying to bring together inferences from genes, languages, and archaeology together in Europe. And doing so, solve this 200-year-old debate about the origins and diversifications of this language family. I think it probably isn't over yet. I think there are still quite a few question marks on that figure, and therefore I think some exciting challenges to come. Thank you.